See that here in the background. Very warm welcome to all of you for this wonderful occasion. This is the fireplace or fireside chat of the 4th Nature Marsilius Visiting Fellowship, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you. And before we start with the discussion, I would like to first make some general announcements and then introduce our panelists. So we are here at the Marsilius Kolleg. This is Heidelberg's Center for Advanced Study, and I'm Matthias Weidemüller. I'm a quantum scientist and at the same time currently serving as the Vice Director for Innovation and Transfer here at Heidelberg University. So as you probably all know, the participants here of course know, but the ones that are seeing the recording, the Marsilius Kolleg has a very special mission. It is rather unique in the German scientific landscape. We are trying to bridge the gap between all these different disciplines and to have a forum where people from all different backgrounds, people from the university can share their opinions and work on joint projects. Communication, in particular science communication, plays a very important role, of course, when it comes to working in this interdisciplinarity. And therefore, this science communication is very dear to the heart also of the Marsilius Kolleg. So some words about this Nature Marsilius Visiting Professorship. This is the 4th one, as I already said. And it was established in 2018 for the first time. It's a joint initiative by the Holzbrink Berlin, the Klaus Tschira Foundation, and Heidelberg University. And I'm very happy that representatives of these institutions are here today. I see Renate Ries from the Tschira Foundation, Tschira Stiftung. Carsten Konecker is, there he is. Very warm welcome. Friederike Busch, Ursel Zetsche, from the Holzbrink Berlin, welcome, and we are very glad to have you here. And the university is represented, of course, by all the different Marsilius fellows and the panelists here. So the goal of this visiting professorship is that we want to attract outstanding personalities dealing with science communication. And we want to show to all the members of the university, starting from the students to the professors, how you can actually do science communication in a highly qualitative way. We want to look and discuss, and probably this will be also topic today, how you can have new formats in science communication, how you can do experiments, and how can we also teach these skills in science communication to each other and also to our students. So what is the role of this fireside chat, which seems to be at the right time if I look outside and if I look at the weather, right temperatures for a fireside chat. It's a form to introduce our awardee, if you like. It is also to discuss with the Marsilius Fellows of this year, and it is therefore also made accessible to the people somewhere else via this video that is currently being recorded. So I would like to introduce the panelists so that we can get directly started. Maybe I start to my left-hand side. This is Annika Elstermann. She is a scholar in English literature, and she has completed her doctorate in 2021 on the topic Literature in a Digital Age. And since October 2021, she is also a Young Marsilius Fellow at the Marsilius Kolleg. And the Young Marsilius Fellows, this is a new program also allowing now younger people to participate in this exclusive club, I should say. I enjoyed it a lot, but at my time there was no Young Marsilius Fellows. It would have probably helped. There is Michael.
We were still young then.
Yeah, we feel. So there is here to my right-hand side, there is Michael Boutros. He's a professor of cell and molecular biology at Heidelberg University. At the same time, he's the head of the division Signaling and Functional Genomics at the German Cancer Research Center. Michael, at the same time, is one of the directors, currently together with Friederike Nüssel, of the Marsilius Kolleg. He is guiding the discussion, setting the topics, choosing the people, so forth. And then, of course, I come now to our special guest here today, Ionica Smeets. She is from the Netherlands. She did her bachelor and master in applied mathematics at Delft University of Technology. Since 2004 already, she started to work as a freelance science journalist, even before the time she got her PhD. Her PhD was at Leiden University with a dissertation on continued fractional algorithms. She then already moved as a postdoc into public understanding of science, and since 2015 she also holds a professorship of science communication at Leiden University, which is still, as I see here, assigned to the biology department, but probably serving for a broader audience. So just to give you some background of what she's doing, she already started 2006 with her first blog, Wiskunde Mathematics Girls, yeah. Math Girls. Then she has a column at one of the most important high-quality newspapers in the Netherlands, de Volkskrant. She is also hosting Eureka. This is a show on the Dutch national and television about mathematics. And she is also very active as a writer in many different instances, also including books. There was 2020 the book Superlogisch. Was it in Netherlands or was it in English? Superlogisch could also be German. And 2021 Rekenen voor je leven, calculating for your life, probably also addressing the fascination of mathematics to young people, together with Edvard van de Vendel. So she is having different research themes, authenticity in informal learning, and of course she wants to bridge this gap between experts and the general public. And there are some examples of her research. She looks at how public press is exaggerating in science, and we already had some nice discussions about this during lunch, and probably we will dwell deeper in this today. What about citizen science projects? What's the advantage and what is the experiences people are having with this? What is the differences in interpreting jargon and using certain language? And how can you develop material that is really evidence-based? So this is it's great to have you here. There's going to be more events with Ionica in the course of her stay here in Heidelberg, but we are going to start today with this panel discussion here. So maybe just to get it started, I mean, the first question one would like to ask, and maybe we start with you. I mean, why should I do science communication at all? Why not spend the money on quantum science?
Yes, yeah, I was afraid you would ask that. I think it's very good to differentiate between why should I do it and why should we do it as academia. So I think as academia we should feel responsible for science communication, but that doesn't mean that everyone should do it. So if you prefer to stay in your quantum lab for whatever reason, that is fine, but there should be others in physics who do it. And for me, the main reason is to have a function in democracy. You want people to be close enough to science. You want people to make good decisions about their own life. And we are mainly paid by taxpayers' money. So we should communicate with the citizens. And also, I quite optimistically and strongly believe that we do science because we want to improve the world, that we are idealistic people, and I see some people nodding. And if you don't involve society with that, then it's very hard, I think, to have a real impact.
Maybe we just open this to the entire round, because there might be different views on this. So why do you think we should do science communication?
I mean, pragmatically, the taxpayer argument is also the one I completely agree with. If somebody gives me money, if I gave somebody money, I would also want to know what they do with it. So I think people just very basically have a right to be part of, to also benefit from the science that we produce here. More philosophically, I think I would say, from the humanities point of view at least, why do it if you're not going to communicate it? So why write the book? Or, well, I mean, you wouldn't write a book. The book is already science communication. So why sit around and have these thoughts if you're not going to share them with anybody? I mean, I suppose there are also many different levels of science communication, but also in the natural sciences, if you collaborate with other people, you have to do some degree of communication with them as well, if they have different specialties and so on. And similarly, I think it goes for communicating with the public. So if you're just going to keep all of your thoughts for yourself, why have them? Even that would be the more philosophical answer.
So, Michael, what would be your take?
I mean, I think as scientists, we like to talk about our work, right? I mean, we kind of do science because we talk with colleagues about the results, and we talk, of course, also with many others to explain basically the impact of the work we do, and maybe it also explains something about the world in general. And I think the kind of what probably happened in the last maybe century, that a lot of like scientific fields become more and more specialized, and was much more difficult basically to communicate what we do, basically what our processes are, how we do scientific research. And I think we need to be aware of this, and we need to find ways how to communicate that. And I think there's also probably a difference in terms of science communication from an institutional point of view that has also a lot of things to do with, of course, being kind of responsible for taxpayers' money or for other funders, basically, that fund our research, but also at the individual level, where we would like to get people excited about our work, to communicate it basically well, and at the end also to basically grow the next generation of scientists. And I think for this, we need to basically explain it also in a manner that other people understand it.
And for my add also, I think there is a very selfish reason that many scientists like doing science communication, because it can also be so uplifting. I mean, you're stuck in your research and everything is going really slowly, and then you go to a school class of 12-year-olds, and at the end you get 30 fist bumps and they're all very excited. I mean, that's, you know, it's something that has a short deadline and immediately responds, and it's so different from doing science.
And also, I think it can also be part of doing science. So, because you just mentioned you go to, for example, a school, I mean, teaching at university level is slightly different than that, of course, but it's similar to that. I could be standing in front and just like telling people things that I already know, but communication can also go both ways. And I'm sure the students at school or people in the general public that you communicate with, they'll have questions that you might not have thought of otherwise, and they'll ask you something and force you to think about it in a completely different way. So I think it can also benefit research very directly in that way, that it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, but if I listen to your different perspectives, which in some parts actually agree with each other, what I see is that, of course, you have to always consider that there's very different target groups here. Mm-hmm. I mean, and very different goals that you associate with your science communication. So how do you deal with this question on targeting your communication to the right group? How would you do that in a way that you're not missing the group? That's one thing, and that you're not, let's say, I would say maybe misusing the group for your own purposes to a certain extent. Because you said rightly, I mean, it's enjoyable to go and present your stuff, but it might not be as enjoyable to the group that you're currently targeting.
Yes, well, I think that depends a lot on the field. So we have a master specialization, and I recently asked my colleagues, like, what is the most important thing that we want our students to remember? And then everyone answered independently, and we all said the same thing, like, think about your target group. So think about what they need, what they want. Also ask them. So I think it's very simple to evaluate more, to see if you are reaching the goals you have. And I think quite often people are very naive about this. So that you ask this question shows that you've been thinking about it. Because quite often people say, well, we'll just do something for the general public. And then when you see what they actually reach is, I'm not sure if it's the same in Germany, but in the Netherlands there are a lot of lectures about science that are mainly attended by retired physics teachers. And that's not the general audience. So, and what I really like about stating these things is also that you can check them. So with my boss, the director of biology, who doesn't know that much about science communication, but I have to say each year what I'm going to do. So we made a children's book last year, and that was aimed at kids who don't like mathematics but do like reading. So I made it with one of the most famous Dutch children's books authors and an illustrator, and it's really a story. It's really a nice story about a class and their adventures and how they are in love with each other. And in between there are math lessons which are drawn as comics, because we know from the literature that comics can really help to explain hard things. And then I also went to classes and test them. And I said beforehand that I would like to go to the it's very easy to go only in the Netherlands to the part around Amsterdam, to only do some lectures there. That's where I live. That's where all the university people are for my university. So I said, okay, I want to do something different. And then I also had to show it to my boss. Like, okay, I really went through the country, and I also targeted some schools with low social economic status background to make sure that I saw other kids. And then I gave all the kids a form to check if they liked it. So,
what was the outcome?
Yeah, they liked it. They thought some things were a bit difficult, but then the comics were really good.
So, Annika, you're having your own blog, right? Or not blog, a podcast, actually.
Yeah, and that has a very specific target group. I have to say that to make it transparent. We have a lecture series in literary studies at our department, and that has been going on for quite some time. It's a kind of a long-standing tradition. And then when the pandemic hit, and we couldn't do in-person teaching, that was obviously one of the, a big lecture with 200 people attending it. It was obvious that we couldn't do it anymore, and I didn't want to pause it, first of all, and I also didn't want to make it a format that is just a pre-recorded talk by one person, because the lecture series is something that is attended by not just students, but also former members of staff and kind of friends of the department and so on. So, but then obviously it's a very specific audience because it's all academics. So there's no children there. There's no people who haven't attended university ever in their life who go to this lecture. But the format is one where it's very open and more focused on dialogue. And I wanted to kind of reproduce that in some way. So I decided to do a podcast, which is a conversation between two people. So I would have somebody come to my office, or when it was really bad, we'd do it via video every week, and I would have a conversation with them. So we'd agree on a topic beforehand, and then I'd just ask them questions about it, and they'd talk for a bit, and I would just, it's a great format for me. I really enjoy it. And it was a way to keep this dialogue and keep it a bit more open, make it a bit more accessible. And then what I noticed through having it in that way and through having it available as well on our website is that I actually ended up sending it to people who wouldn't attend the lecture series beforehand. So I could send it to my sister, I could send it to a friend of mine who's a medical doctor and so on. And I heard from other people as well. So students then later told me, my boyfriend who I live with started listening to this lecture series with me, or I showed this to my parents to show them what we do at university. So it broadened the audience a bit. And I think also because of the format, we ended up doing it a bit less strictly in a dusty academic way, but made it a bit more interesting and dialogical as well.
And are you planning to continue with that, or how would you, or from your experience, what were the experiences that you would like to give to others who are maybe thinking of starting something like that? What was the big failures and what was the big successes?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it was any big failure, but it is a ton of work. So if anybody's thinking about doing it, definitely know that it's so much more work than just sitting down and having a chat. I learned a lot about the technical side of recording and audio editing, and it was just so nice. It gave me really a different way of looking at research myself as well, and also my colleagues' research. So we're probably not going to do this particular lecture series as a podcast anymore because people are itching to go back to in-person teaching, and I'm not going to force my colleagues to do this just because I was having so much fun. But I might actually do it for the project I'm working on now. I might do it a bit broader and interdisciplinary as well. What I found was that it's really interesting to talk to people about their research. And it's such a basic thing, but it's something which I think gets lost a bit in the day-to-day. So everybody's kind of working on their projects and writing their grant applications and trying to get their teaching in and all that. And you kind of don't think about it that much. But people work on projects that they're really interested in, and I find them very interesting. And it's so great to be able to talk to somebody who's just passionate about this thing they're doing, and they know very much about it because they're doing research on it. So I would very much like to continue that, just because it's so nice to see how people engage with their topics differently when you just ask them questions. And I actually ended up not having to prepare much after a while, because I just asked people things I was interested in, and then they were experts on the topic, and so we could just have a conversation like that. Yeah.
There, of course, the Marsilius colleague is a great platform, if you like, or a great forum where this can be done, right? So, Michael,
I think the really interesting thing is about that there are many different, let's say, ways someone can go about science communication, and because of novel technologies, but also what basically pandemic has taught us, there are many more channels. I mean, just to mention two examples where Marsilius colleague or my research group has been involved in. One of them was actually a pop-up store in Heidelberg Main Street. So, and there was an empty store, and the institute basically took it over for a month together with the city to present basically research every day, a different research topic, and maybe some experiments actually that people could do in the store. And that has been a great experience for everybody involved, because you couldn't really know who works in the store. Yeah? And what question would there be? It's not a lecture format. It's really what people want to know about genome engineering, or people want to know what DNA is about at many, many different levels. Kids went in there. My daughter went in there and learned how to extract DNA. Yeah. And so there's so many different levels about it, also really to communicate directly and to engage, get people excited about it. And I think that's a great way of getting people, speaking to people how basically science, how research works, and to get engaged. Another example that I could mention here, what we do at the Marsilius colleague, are these discussions which we call Marsilius controverse. And these are basically topics that often arise through most of the time arise through fellow projects, really on topics where we could have very different opinions about it. Yeah? On public health, on is one allowed to modify human genome, to vaccinations against coronaviruses, and then have different fellows and also external people really discussing this in a controversial way, and also for the public basically to pose questions. That's another level basically how one can engage in science communication also on an institutional basis. And I think for people involved it has been interesting, fun, sometimes also controversial. But I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm always wondering in the context of science communication. How political is science communication? Of course, you choose target groups, and in many cases, of course, there's also goal associated with this with communication. Sometimes this goal is made explicit, but sometimes this goal is not so explicit in terms of like trying to move using science arguments, moving people in one or the other direction. What would you say? Science communication, is it political? Does it serve a political task? Should it be used for political reasons? What is your take on this?
Yeah, I think you should be very clear on that for yourself. And I think lots of times scientists are saying that they are just informing people while they actually want to persuade them. And the rather infamous example is a flyer in the UK made to inform women about breast cancer screening. And the flyer says, it's your choice. And the people who made it really wanted to inform. They said, well, you know, there is no very strong common opinion in the medical world whether you should do it. So they just explain the risks and benefits of doing it. So they were informing. But then this information was sent with a letter that says, your appointment for breast cancer screening is next Wednesday at 12. And there were some, like, somewhere in the little letters you could find how to cancel it. Then you're not informing, then you are pushing, and then you shouldn't pretend that you are informing. So I think it's okay in some cases, because science itself is also political in some sense, and there are very good reasons to persuade people to do something, but then you should be clear about that that's what you're doing. So there are in the Netherlands quite some lung cancer doctors who are very activistic in getting people to smoke, to stop smoking, to prevent. Not smoking. That would be a very good business model. But no, but they're very activistic, and I think no one is saying like, oh, you should be scientific. You cannot persuade people. That people are understanding that.
What would you say?
Yeah, I think science. I mean, I think everything is political. And I think to pretend that you're doing something apolitical just means that either you're consciously or unconsciously ignoring your own bias. So if, for instance, in the humanities, everything we do is informed by our own, I mean, I suppose it's probably the same in the natural sciences, by our own preconceptions and so on. And I don't think it's possible to do something that is entirely apolitical. And I think it's perfectly fine if science communication is also political. I mean, the mere act of communicating science is political because it means that even if you do it transparently and openly and as objectively as you can, you're informing people to make their own decisions. And that is in some way political. Other people might not want that. Other people might prefer it if information is kept to a certain smaller group of people. So that in itself is political. And I think as long as we as humans are persons, we're political. And so the science we communicate is also going to be political. But I don't see a problem with that. The problem is, as Ionica just also said, if it's instrumentalized and that is not made transparent. So if the pretense is that you're getting some kind of objective information now and it's just to inform you, but really the information skews a certain way and it's meant to influence you in a certain way, that would be a misuse of a misusing politicization of science communication, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, there's this typical humanities argument. Everything is political. I mean, it's also a little bit arbitrary from my perspective. From a natural science point of view, would you agree that everything is political? I don't know.
I mean, there are probably areas that are more political or less political. I mean, let's say discovering a new star may be probably less political than
communicating this. Yeah.
Communicating breast cancer. But like, there's another politics involved. Maybe people basically present it because they want to receive new funding for it or something.
Yeah, but
like
now
we're
stretching.
Yeah, but it's and that's why I would say that's probably less political, right? But I mean, they are. I think, as you said, it's important to be transparent about it. I think in the, let's say, biomedical community, there's been a lot of, let's say, discussion about basically declaring conflicts of interest that might exist, basically talking about a new treatment when there is actually a conflict of interest about it and declaring this up front. And one probably has to look at this in many different contexts in the same way. But I think there are also areas where this is maybe more really about, let's say, where science communication is also about education, where people really make a lot of effort to present also information in an unbiased way. And there I would be, let's say, less comfortable with saying this really has a strong political component about it. Yeah.
But yeah, dwelling a little bit more in this direction, also this taxpayer argument that was brought forward, and of course where everybody immediately agrees. I mean, of course, I mean, we are paid by public money, and somehow it makes sense that we give something back to the public of what we actually do with this money. But do you think we are obliged to do this? How far would you go?
I think if you don't do it, you will lose all support. I mean, we are all worried, I think, after the pandemic or during the pandemic, that trust in science is something that's very fragile. And if you are, you know, there's this whole stereotype about scientists in the ivory tower. Well, I think actually it hasn't been like that for ages. But if you go back to that model, then I think public trust, you will lose it very fast. And then it will just be some scientists who are very rich and can still keep doing their work without support from the public.
Yeah, do you feel obliged?
I mean, I think, I mean, so let's say for communicating the results of my research that I do, I think I feel very much obliged, right? But I think because these are, I mean, to be publishable findings, there's no way to withhold them. I mean, the question is sometimes whether I'm, or let's say the field is general, best in communicating this finding in the general understandable way, and whether I'm the right person to communicate this, so other people might be better qualified to do this. So I think that's kind of a discussion that one also needs to have. Not maybe every great scientist is a great scientist or needs to be a great scientist in communication. If that's the case, that's, I think, perfect. but it's also maybe not always possible. I think one point that I wanted to make, I think what we might need to do more is also explain actually how scientific research works, actually what the processes are. And I mean, during the pandemic, there was kind of a lot of debate about that there were actually different opinions about the subject. And as scientists would say, well, that's kind of the normal process. If let's say if it has not solidified, if it has basically, it's early in the process. And I think that's actually also important to communicate how actually a scientific process works, and then when basically a scientific result is believable and when it's not, and what's basically attached to it. Yeah.
And what would you think would be a good way to let people participate in this process of gaining knowledge through scientific approaches?
I mean, there are kind of efforts really to involve people in some kind of science citizen lab or real world lab, where people can, also general public can experience how it works basically to generate scientific findings. This might be one step of it, but it's, of course, I mean, there are areas where this might be much more difficult. I don't know about quantum dynamics or so, but or let's say if you run a large scale experiments, which is very, very abstract. But I think how scientific discovery works and what uncertainties exist for a very long time, I think that's actually important to communicate too.
Yeah, I mean, we have this complicated thing of, on the one hand side, conveying the Zauber, I can't translate that, the Zauber of science, and at the same time, not trivializing it. Yeah. How do you make sure that, I mean, you had this thesis, I have to even check it because I couldn't, okay, this was easy to remember, literature in a digital age, but I'm sure that the things that you figured out in your thesis were really digging deep into existing literature, into different views on that. So how do you make sure that you convey this in a way that on the one hand side, people can experience what you experience when you discovered these things, and at the same time, it doesn't become a totally trivial summary of literature in the digital age.
Yeah, I actually think the humanities and the natural sciences have slightly different problems there, because at least from my point of view, for the natural sciences, the initial bar is much higher. So if you say you do something with quantum physics, you're going to have to start explaining to people what quantum physics is first. When I say I work in literary studies, a lot of people go like, oh, I also read a book recently. I recently read a book, and then they tell me about the book they read. So I think our entry bar is much, much lower. But also then the problem is to explain to people that it's a bit more complicated than that, while at the same time not making it purposely obtuse in some way. So not doing this thing where you use a lot of big words and long sentences and so on, just to make it look more complicated, so that the people you're talking to don't think that they're on the same level as you. That's, of course, nonsense. But also you have to simultaneously make it more complex and also make the complication simpler so that people can understand it again. I think that's very tricky. Whereas in the natural sciences, my impression is always that you have to lower the entry level and just, first of all, explain to people in simple terms what you're doing so that you can get them on board. Whereas in the humanities, often they're already on board. No, also, I think there's some historians in the group here. For historians, I think there's also this problem where everybody's like, oh, I've read a book about the Tudors, so now we did the Romans at school, so they think they know so much about it, but then you have to explain to them how it's actually more complex, while still explaining it in a way that they can access and understand it.
But might happen with Schrödinger's cat as well, I assure you. but let's dig a little bit, I love this, on the clash of cultures. We talked about snow during lunch. So what's your who is more present in science communication? If you look at the different media, different channels that are possible, the humanities, the natural sciences, is there any kind of friction between these two cultures? If we look at science communication, what is your experience?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, about like what are big challenges for science communication. And one of them I included is that the humanities and social sciences are quite often not on board. And I know in German, Wissenschaft includes everything, while science, and in the same in the Netherlands, is only looking at the natural sciences. And so, for instance, there's this competition Fame Lab, like which PhD student can pitch their research the best. It's only for life sciences, natural sciences, and the humanities are not even allowed to enter. And it's the same. So there's like the overarching board of science musea and science centers. And I asked them, like, how many of your musea and expositions are about humanities or social sciences? And it was less than 5%. Well, there are museums about all these things, but they are not considered science museums. And also in the research in the field, so if you look at a field analysis on what is being studied in topics in science communication, it's mainly biology and some other natural sciences, a lot of astronomy. So that's difficult. And we discussed, I was in a fight about this a few weeks ago in Brussels with someone from Karlsruhe who said, no, it's the humanities who get all the news all the time. So I'm wondering, if, like, is it different in Germany? Or are we defining it differently? Because that would be very surprising.
Yeah, we have these feuilletons, of course, which are totally taken over by the humanities and social sciences, whereas the typical, let's say, science page is then for the sciences. But what I also encountered is, for example, we had this mall showing science in the general sense now, Wetenschap, Wissenschaft. And then there was these people from philosophy department saying, but you know, you guys, you have a great job. You just show your crazy apparatus, or you make this nice, make gene editing or whatever in life, yeah, and the kids will be excited. What can we do? But I told them, why don't you just place yourself there and you put a sign, ask everybody, like with the, you know, you can ask any question allowed. Yeah. So what would
I'm a philosopher.
Yeah, I'm a philosopher. Any question allowed would have great impact, I'm sure. I remember this from the Peanuts. You know, there was always this one character there. Yeah. So, do you agree, or would you agree that there's a discrepancy between how cool you can show something in the natural sciences compared to how cool something could be that you present?
I don't think so, because in Heidelberg, for instance, we have the Mittelaltertag, which is coming up soon, and I think that is massively popular, and of course that is focused on the humanities, because it's about medieval Europe, and people find ways. So I don't know if it happens regularly, but I remember there was somebody who just put on a knight's armor. And like that was the first presentation he did was putting it on, and the second was taking it off. So just to show to people what this actually meant, because people have this concept of the knight on the horse, but like what goes into that, how long does it take, how complicated is it, and so on. And I think that's pretty cool, and that's also a practical application and something that children can watch and be in awe of. And there are, I mean, that's a very flashy example now, but I also think that many things that we do, this, what I said earlier, like so many people like reading, and so I think it's actually easy to engage with them where they are already, and it doesn't need to go boom and be like a chemical experiment in order to take people in. But I do agree completely that there is a massive discrepancy in how much science communication is done and also how much attention it gets. But I think that probably, I mean, this is now just a hypothesis, but I would think that that comes from somewhere else, and that is that the natural sciences have kind of professionalized this so much in the last 10, 15, 20 years maybe. And of course, the natural sciences need so much more funding. And if you need funding that is regularly in the millions, the expectation is probably came sooner to, well, what are you actually doing with this kind of money? Whereas the humanities, which is kind of doing their thing for a really long time, and now we have this gap in between. And I think
astronomy is also pretty old.
Yeah.
But they didn't start doing...
But it's not cheap, huh?
Yeah, it's not cheap. You need so much money.
History could also get more expensive, I mean, or humanities.
I mean, but it would be inflated, like, artificially, whereas to do these experiments and to send something into space to build this telescope, you need the money. You can't really do it without the money. And so I think it's a really good thing that humanities are kind of catching up, but I think it would be a huge problem for the humanities if they now just try to emulate what the natural sciences are doing. And they feel like, oh, we're lagging behind, let's look at what the physicists are doing, and let's show them something that goes boom. It's not going to work that way. So the humanities are just going to have to figure out something for themselves.
I mean, I think where basically humanities and natural science probably share kind of some way of science communications are collections, right? Where one tries to explain basically at least what has been done in the past and how certain instruments might look at how experiments have worked. But again, I mean, this also addresses only a certain spectrum of the general public who would actually go into a collection to look at this. I mean, I think one of the challenges and also the dangers that science communication has, in particular also life science or biomedical science, is to make predictions about the future. Let's say developing a novel treatment for a disease or finding a gene that might have been linked to a certain disease. And there, I think it became better in the last years to communicate risk uncertainties in a manner that not everything that was found is a solution for a problem, but just might be the first step towards more research that actually is necessary. And I think this way of communicating is also important, because I kind of looked back like about 20 years ago. One of the largest projects for biology was basically sequencing the human genome with a large international effort. And if one thinks back, one always has these headlines or recognizes letters decoding the human genome. And it was, of course, not decoded. It was basically just the sequence. So one basically just had the letters that one knew basically or could read to a certain extent. But it also was basically representing a certain promise to the future, right? That this would now solve many different things. If one actually goes back to the original press release, they were actually most of them were actually quite subdued, right? I say it's like the initial kind of steps towards, but it all then got more and more condensed, where then many people did not talk about the limitations, but now only talk about the promises. And I think that got better in the last probably 10 years.
Yeah, but you don't think that, I mean, if you look at the problems we are currently facing and very uncertain times, it would be great if also the social sciences and the humanities would make more promises?
No, actually, no. I think
there's nothing wrong with promise.
No,
yeah, that's what I think.
No, we should make realistic promises. And I want to add to you that you said that it's also a matter of budget. I think also the other way around, that the budgets are so much bigger in natural sciences. If that you then spend 1 or 2% on communication, you have a huge budget for communication. While in the humanities, if you spend 1 or 2% of your budget, it's...
You can print one flyer.
Yes. But yeah, so for me, I feel very strange, because I'm now really a communication scholar. So when I go to academic conferences, I'm between people from the humanities and the social sciences, and that's the kind of research I do. But I'm a mathematician by training. I'm between biologists. And for me, I really think that the people who are on the good side, where it's easier, should help the others. So I'm really trying, whenever I'm organizing something, to say, like, we should have sessions with people from the humanities. Let's get some good scholars from the humanities in here. Let's get some social scientists. And whenever we're setting up an interdisciplinary project and they're saying, oh, it's very interdisciplinary because we have biologists who do microbiology from 3 different perspectives, I'm saying, well, maybe we could ask someone from the psychology department to join us, or maybe someone from journalism studies. So I think that is something that you can do both ways. And then also in the humanities, there are some people who are really reaching out to the bigger community and to join forces.
Yeah, maybe what we should do is open the discussion here also to the people being present here, and maybe there are some topics you would like to raise or comments you would like to give to what was being said so far. I was told that please, when you want to make a comment or ask a question, you should first wait for the microphone that is there, because otherwise, when it's recorded, the people wouldn't understand the question. So, are there comments, questions from the Marsilius fellows around here? Or the audience, yeah.
Well, I like the idea to spend a certain percentage of a budget onto a certain activity, in this case, public outreach. Now, what percentage is it that you would think is an adequate one? You said 1 or 2%. Is that something that's really feasible? You know, if you look at the James Webb Telescope, is that really what they do to spend out of the 11 billion that costs? I need to quickly check, about 100 million in public outreach. I mean, how much does the university spend? Does anybody know?
To be honest, I don't. I said 1% because I am in a huge quantum project, and I know there roughly 1% is going to societal aspects, and it's not just science communication, but also ethical and legal aspects. And I just realized that 1% of such a huge project is for a communication group a lot of money, while for physicists it's not that much because they need all the expensive equipment. And so I don't know. I don't think we should really set those budgets. But also it's very dangerous if you say that in every project you should spend that much money on it. Like you said, not every scientist will be great at doing this. So it might be better to do it sort of overarching indeed as a university. But I don't know. What would the best?
But I think, for example, in some areas for... like, for example, genome sciences, there were like a low percentage, 1 to 3%, that were really spent on ethical, legal, and societal aspects. It's not only communication, as you said, but there was a substantial amount that was actually used for this, also to foster basically research into this question of ethical ramifications.
And we see that with grant proposals these days. I mean, if you go for an SFB, for a cooperative research center, you can assign a budget that is on the percent level, actually, depending on, of course, what you apply for science communication and general transfer issues. It's part of the Excellence Cluster initiatives. Of course, CERN budget for PR is high and necessary because you need to make sure that people still are willing to pay for the next bigger accelerator. But I can see that even for that is for all disciplines here, German funding agency or European funding, you get money, sufficient money. You would get sufficient money for your communication purposes if you applied for it, and you're willing to actually fill it with life. That's of course the condition.
I think adding to this, I think it will be really good to have small budgets for younger people. So I remember when I was a PhD and we started blogging, and we had these ideas that we wanted to do something for mathematics teachers, and it didn't cost a lot. So it was like 2,000 euros. But when you're a PhD student, you don't have a budget. And then we had a professor who just won an award, and he just said, you know, I'll just put some money aside, and whenever a PhD student has an idea, just come to me and I'll fix it. And I think it's really nice to offer those, like...
That's perfect.
That's in these funding schemes.
Nice.
The SFB here, Isoquant, that we are in, they do these science slams, and that is all organized by the younger researchers. So it's part of, you can apply for it if you're willing to spend time on it. We have artists being on residence to explain what a complex quantum system might actually look like, or feel like, let's put it that way. Yeah, let's take more questions. There was...
Yeah, I have a question and comment. So what is the science of science communication? Where are we? What is the art, the tactics? I really enjoyed the conversation, but it's very mild. And I think we need more urgency. We've certainly lost the battle in some ways, or we need to recover trust, and that needs communication. In the United States, in my field now, Fox News has declared epidemiologists and public health experts to be the least trusted of all professions, worse than accountants and politicians. And that's because we failed in communicating in an emerging pandemic that there are new results and there will be revisions, there will be controversies, right? That all this is part of the scientific enterprise. But it's our duty as scientists to communicate that clearly, right? To explain how science works, and we haven't succeeded in doing that. So when Francis Collins, the NIH head, stepped down, he was asked what is his biggest regret, and he said not enough investment as NIH, right? Most investment goes into biological sciences, communication studies, right? We've not learned how to communicate science. And he said, I was totally surprised, very humble man and naive. I thought we had the vaccine, and from that moment on, everybody would want the vaccine. And then he discovered that a large proportion of the US public did not want the vaccine. So we have failed, I think, severely, and we need to learn how to do it better for the next pandemic and emergency and so forth. I think COVID has revealed how bad we are in communicating science, and I miss that urgency and maybe aggressiveness in your discussion.
So Ionica, you're doing the science of science communication, right?
Yes. Yeah, so a few things. So first of all, I think, were you in the humanities surprised that not everyone wanted the vaccine? Because all the social scientists I know were not surprised at all. So I think this is like one thing where the divide between the fields is like the natural scientists were like, oh, there's a vaccine, everything will be well, we will explain it. And we already knew for quite a while that it wouldn't work like that. So talking more between fields. And and you need a lot of studies, indeed, how to do it well. So a really nice study I liked was very simple about graphs. If you show the number of infections or deaths and it's growing exponentially, how do you show it? And most experts prefer logarithmic scales, where it's a straight line and then it's easier to extrapolate. And some popular scientific, but also newspapers, they have that as a policy to use logarithmic scales to show exponential growth. They did a very simple study, like if you show it on a normal linear scale or on a log scale, and you ask people simple question like in which week were the most new infections, or like these really basic things to get out of the graph, but also do you support the measures? And then it turned out it had a huge influence. So if you use linear graphs, people would understand it better, but then maybe not follow the rules. So you have to decide as a policymaker, what do you want? Do you want people to understand what's happening, or do you want them to follow the rules? That's a political decision, but you need to study how to do both. And the last thing I want to say, that the frame about distrust in science, so there was a really interesting talk by Massimo Di Buggi from Italy, who's a science communication scholar, and that really raged against this. So he showed all these recent surveys that show that trust in science in Europe is still high. It's actually grown a bit in the last 2 years. So the group that is anti-science is very loud, but it isn't growing that much. And the frame that people are distrustful and that it's things like Fox News that are... that is also a bit shifting the blame. It's the fault from the journalist, it's the fault from the people, and we don't have to change anything. We're doing fine. He actually summarized there's a lot of misinformation about misinformation. And I think that's a very optimistic and pessimistic point at the same time.
I would also just quickly like to add to, because you mentioned you missed the urgency, I think it's also, there is some danger in being too urgent. So if we take, for instance, the Fox News rhetoric, which is effective in some ways, we don't want to do that. So we don't want to be the ones who push out these clickbait headlines. We want to show to people that it's a gradual process that takes time and deliberation, and sometimes there isn't a clear answer and so on. And I don't think that you can actually do that with too much urgency behind it. So I wouldn't also see it so much as preparing for the next disaster and the next catastrophe so that we can react quickly and better then, but rather steadily now laying groundwork in a deliberate and perhaps slower process, but doing it deliberately and not trying to do it so urgently, quickly, and then maybe making mistakes.
Yeah, that's not what I meant with urgency, that we should do it hastily and wrongly, right? It's more the, that we are not necessarily winning the battle, but I get it that, of course, Fox News is exploiting and is creating distrust in science very actively. And it's a narrative that is built, and then maybe we shouldn't buy into it too much, but it would also be complacent to say everybody's on board, it's all fine, has even gone up a little bit. We do have large swaths of the population who are not getting the vaccine against COVID, right? We do have, we see the numbers, and in the US they may be more extreme than in Europe. Yeah.
But maybe it's also a little bit about what one, let's say, which formats one uses for science communication, as was discussed also at the beginning, and also whether science communication is a one-way or a two-way street. Yeah. And as lecturers, we kind of try to get basically, try to convey basically our wisdom or our what we think is the right opinion, but to engage in a discussion that also can have very controversial features is maybe something that we also need to do more, and that maybe we are not always comfortable with doing. Right?
And for me, there was a really strong urgency to come back to academia. So in between my postdoc and becoming a professor in Leiden, I was a self-employed journalist for a few years. And I noticed that all these things that weren't going well in science communication. And I was really thinking about, like, where can I have the biggest impact? Where can I change the most? And I really think that is within academia. So we cannot change how the general public think, and we cannot change how all journalists work. But we can do quite a lot by giving better messages. So what you said before about the health news that was exaggerated, a lot of that is coming from within academia, not from journalists. And we can study like how to reach the population. So we know indeed there's a small group that's very much against it, and there's a much bigger group who doesn't know. And they are the ones we can reach, but we should figure out how to and study this. And so for me, there is a really strong urgency, and also we are so responsible. We should feel so responsible, and it's so easy to wave away, like, oh, all these things are happening in society, and it's going wrong, and we don't know what's happening. No, we should be the ones to take action and improve science and society, the connection with it.
Yeah, and we are quickly entering a discussion that is not just about science communication, but on education in general, of course, when we have these topics. Another question, please.
So I wonder, one of the pillars of science is obviously peer review, right? And I think we learned that also in the pandemic. There's a difference between preprints and something that has been reviewed and criticized and maybe revised by our colleagues. How does that have a role? Does it have a role in science communication? Because, you know, if I put something out and it's a crazy idea and then the reviewer says, but, you know, tone it down, I publish it, and then I go out and, of course, I bring my crazy idea out into the world and there is no checks and balances anymore. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, if I may, I actually think that all the editors I worked with as a popular scientific writer, as a scientific journalist, are actually stricter than most of the scientific reviewers I get. So there are very good quality standards. If you write an academic book, I think the feedback you get is rather minimal. And when, you know, I have an editor at a publisher who's paid to, you know, check my book 10 times and to think along and tell me, rewrite it, otherwise we won't publish it. So I think you can have very easily quality standards that are just as good as peer review or even better.
Does that also hold for articles? For books, I totally agree, because we are encountering a very bad development, and science books are no longer being editorially being checked in general. I mean, there's exceptions. But does that also hold for articles?
What do you mean, that peer review isn't always great?
No, I'm happy with peer review, I have to say, because, as I said, it kept me from publishing lots of crazy ideas,
yes.
and maybe mankind was also saved. But if you publish now science communication articles, is there a review, or is there a kind of...
Yeah, it depends. So if you do it on your blog,
check,
you can do whatever you
balance.
want. But if you do it for... So I write a column for the newspaper, and that's checked every week
in the Volkskrant,
by 2 different people. Yeah, and I know Der Spiegel. How many fact checkers do they have? My God, it's a lot.
But then also, isn't it like automatically built in once you go out into the world with your crazy idea, and then another scientist can also say, that guy's crazy. And I think we've also seen that a couple of times in the pandemic now with some of the scientists who were also in the news and so on, but were discredited by colleagues who then also went onto the news.
Uli, yeah?
Yeah, I would like to follow up on Till's remark on the pandemics. So, and I would like to pick up the example of masks. So at the beginning, the scientific consensus was that they are useless, and then it changed that they are good. And I think if the scientific opinion can change so much, then in the first instance, the uncertainty was just ignored. And in my opinion, the uncertainty communication is just too bad. And bad uncertainty communication destroys trust. And so what we should do is to honestly express the uncertainty and to also explain how we are going forward to reduce the uncertainty. So which kind of experiments we would like to do and why. And I think we haven't done enough in terms of masks. So I think we still don't know for sure whether masks outside in the open air are of any use or not. Yeah, and I see this, that's one of my favorite topics, being a uncertainty guy. I see this everywhere, that the uncertainty is not taken into account properly. I think it's a very, I have mentioned this example before also, the difference between Newton's theory and relativity theory. So, and I think the public opinion, or how it is presented, is that relativity theory disproved Newton's theory. Yeah? And that's just not true. It just clarified the scope of Newton's theory. So if you don't go to high velocities, like the velocity of speed, then Newton's theory is perfectly okay. Yeah? And the only problem was that the uncertainty in Newton's theory about its scope wasn't communicated properly before Einstein came and clarified it, right? And that it's a recurring problem everywhere. And I don't know, I have been thinking about this, but I don't know really how we should do it. So if we communicate too much of uncertainty, then trust will be destroyed also. If we communicate too little, it doesn't work. So what's the right way?
Yeah, the research on this is very depressing. So I'm in a reading group communicating about statistics and numbers and uncertainties, and then we read the literature and discuss it. It's online. There's actually one German participant who joined us. So let me know if you want to join. But it is really hard. And there were lab studies during Corona done that said showing these uncertainties will help people. And then at the same time, you saw in real life that these uncertainties were being shown and people were sort of rebelling against it. And also, like, one of the weird things, like if you say that there is an interval, like you know it's going to be between 17 and 90%, then some people will think it's 70, others will think it's 90, others will still think it's 50-50, like it will either happen or not. And so the thing is that even if you communicate it correctly, and what would be correctly depends very much on the context and the target group and your goals, it will still probably go wrong. In that sense, it's very different than natural science or mathematics, where if you do it in the same way, it will end up in the same way.
Yeah, but first of all, if I would ask the question here in this round, what do you consider, or what do you understand, or what is meant by uncertainty, I would probably get 10 different answers. That's one point. And the second point is, even in the, let's say, mathematical sciences or physics, we have a hard time to quantify uncertainty when it comes to distribution functions that are not Gaussian. Of course, we are used and trained in thinking of Gaussian functions, but most of the stuff that we find outside is actually following totally different distribution functions. And even now, I mean, you know it only as well as I know how difficult it is to train people to use Bayesian statistics. There's even still fights going on whether this is a good statistics or bad statistics. So in this sense, I think part of the problem is that even on a scientific level, it is hard to quantify uncertainty. In particular, if you don't know.
Now we're getting into the science communication of the science communication of uncertainty.
I think it connects a lot to what you said, to communicate more about the process, so to not focus so much on the results. And there are hopeful findings for indeed if you explain how a consensus process works in science, that it helps people to understand and to trust results.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
Yeah. I mean, it's much worse in the humanities to an extent. Because we don't, I mean, some branches of the humanities do, but also in many branches we don't measure things. So it's not like we have, we could even say objectively it's likely this and this. And with, I think for instance, every historian is going to have this problem when they try to communicate something. And what we can say is, well, the historical sources point towards this and this, and then you could maybe say it's likely or it's unlikely or it's more likely than that. But what people will always hear is that's what it was like back then. And then when you introduce any kind of uncertainty to that and say, well, but maybe actually, or from a different perspective, it's all subjective, that doesn't play well on the Discovery Channel, basically. So nobody wants to have a historian sitting there and saying, like, well, the source says this, but the source is highly biased, and we don't know, and the archaeological findings, and so if we want to, that's always the problem, I also think. If you want to be heard, do you give the flashy answer, that's what it was like back then? Modeling, the scientific process as well. It's a problem in the humanities too.
So there's a question again.
Yeah, hello, Stefan Trautmann, Economics Department. So I want to challenge this taxpayer argument. I think the taxpayer might be better served if we communicate with experts, and these experts then use the knowledge in their work. In the natural science, people who work in companies, maybe in psychology, people who work as therapists, in public health, people who work in the government regulation. So I think, I mean, I'm trying to challenge you.
Yes.
So I think a lot of science communication on both sides is just consumption. So it's not really investment. So I think communicating to experts, multipliers, might actually be more valuable spent time and money from the
but that would still be science communication, right? It's to experts who are not in academia, so then it's still...
Well, committee work, training people. Most of what we discussed here was, it's a bit different channel, I would say.
Yeah, I understand. So now it's much more aimed at public outreach and engagement, and of course the other things might benefit society more. And I also agree that a lot of the things are you didn't call entertainment, but consumption.
So if I read something on psychology on the cover page of the Süddeutsche, then I'm just a consumer. I don't really make anything with this. But if a therapist learns this, then so if a therapist learns this new insight from psychology, he or she might use it in her daily work, while I just consume it, and there it ends. I don't really make anything with it.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah.
But I mean, all of it is basically part of what we probably would call transfer, right? I mean, transfer of the, let's say, from the sciences or from the academia into something else. I mean, and that's different for each field, right? I mean, for medicine or biomedical research is to transfer it into new practices in hospitals, or to get patents and basically license or try to make it basically useful, but also to communicate it. And these are probably the different avenues that one can take really to transfer results out of academia or out of research into practical applications. Then, of course, they differ in scope. And if, let's say, in biomedical science, if we only do science communication and would not do any, let's say, transfer into practice, that probably would not be well spent efforts in a way.
But just maybe also what I would like to know, I mean, taking up this point, are there studies on the societal impact? I mean, measured in whatever kind of measure. Could be measured, like you economists, of course, would measure it in money, that's right, dollars, yes. Or euros, or yuan per effort. But it could also be measured by other means. Is there studies which would actually then say science communication is best suited if it, or you call it general transfer, is best suited if it's aiming at, let's say, more specialized groups and then having a leverage? Or is it better to actually go newspapers, spread it over the entire public? Is there studies in this direction? If not, we have a Marsilius project for the next year.
That sounds like a great idea.
I actually don't know. I do realize that what the vast majority of our alumni is doing is exactly what you're saying, but they don't stay in academia, so they are doing this in-between job. But it's usually specialized. And I think what's different is that most people who are in science, it takes a lot of time to do this intermediary work, while doing something for the general public is a bit easier to combine with your academic work. So that's why we are talking more about this. But I agree that science communication in general, the public is probably benefiting more from getting the results to the people who actually use them. But actually also, so one thing, for instance, that is interesting, how people find out about scientific results that they want to use. even scientists find out most things through the media. So if you see people, and it's like, okay, you use this study, how did you find it? It's not because we're all checking the literature all the time. It's because we read something in the paper, like, oh, that's an interesting study. So even to reach other scientists, the media is quite a good way. So also to reach the experts, I think.
So maybe we take one more comment or question, yeah?
Question comment is very much related to your last point. What are your experiences and what is the scientific evidence on alternative channels, different types of media? We've mainly sort of the mental picture I have of your work is quite traditional media. What about social media, influencer strategies, education, entertainment, videos, Audiopedia, little GIFs, right? We use all that in public health, but we are never comparing, right? We're never testing, does the video work better than Audiopedia versus the little GIF versus an in-person engagement such as ours here? Any thoughts, experiences, and evidence, what works?
Yes, I'm in a big Norwegian project that looks at this for video. So we compare the videos made by the WHO and the Norwegian Center for, well, whatever it's called, yes. And then to those made by popular YouTube makers. And then you see that the public health videos are optimized for content and correctness, but completely not for being watchable. And so we're. That's what you need to do. Yes, and I'm very active on Twitter, which is not the most fancy for me, but I know Belgian colleagues are, for instance, studying science on TikTok and Instagram. What works there, what doesn't work, and so there is a lot of that happening, and also like really now. So with the Norwegian study, is also really doing a big randomized controlled trial where professional filmmakers are making movies and they're put out in the real world and to see if they work. But it's quite new, these things, that they're really tested. And I think one of the frustrating things is that you want so many different things. So we measure with surveys like, how does this influence trust in science? How does this enhance knowledge? Does this change their intention to do something? And do they actually watch it? And then these four things are very different. So something that can be great for enhancing trust will not be spontaneously watched outside a lab setting by anyone. So how good is it then?
Yeah, really good. Those are exactly the type of studies we need.
Just like idealistically, from an idealist's point of view, I think if you look at what a lot of people in the social sciences and humanities say about why, for instance, trust is so low, and what the root cause of many of the issues we have is it's social media. And then to go on social media to communicate our science to other people is, to me, very counterintuitive. To say, on the one hand, this is the root cause of all of our problems, and then on the other hand say, we're going to now go there and hang out with all of the people who are there. I know that it's usually what is said is you have to kind of get the people where they are, and they're on Twitter, so we have to go on Twitter and get them there. But what we're not getting them there and moving them anywhere else, really. We're just going there and hanging out with them on Twitter, on Instagram, and on TikTok, and so on. And I think this is also something to keep in mind, this kind of balance between, is it efficient? Does it work? Does it work quickly? Perhaps yes and sure, but also is it ethical? And does this, in the long term, move us in the direction that we want to go in? And that's also something to keep in mind, which I think is why I, for one, am, I think, a bit more traditional in the science communications methods, is that I'm not sure if long-term Twitter and Instagram and TikTok is where we want to be.
I do think, with permission and humbleness, that's a category mistake, right? It's not social media, it's a particular use of social media that leads to distrust.
Yeah.
So maybe we stop the public engagement at this point. That there is some great food and drinks over there, but we will stop the recording then, not to get the others become jealous. I would like to thank all the participants here, and in particular, of course, the panel members for this very vivid and great discussion that we had. Thanks again to the Klaus Tschira Foundation and to the Holzbring Berlin for their generous support. You can see we just started, and as I can already tell, Ionica is going to have a whole series of a public lecture first, lying with numbers, lying with the Y, lying with numbers. Everybody is cordially invited for this event. That's going to be on July 12th She's going to now continue with the great workshop program. Sorry guys, no places left and long waiting lists, which also shows how much of an impact this kind of lecture series has. I would like to thank here the technical team, everybody, Tobias Just in particular for preparing me so great that I could just check everything and have all the important keywords that I needed. And I would like to thank all the audience here that is following this on video also for watching it. So thank you very much, and let's have some more discussion in another surrounding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.